and welcome to Chicanime. My name is Lauren, and today I am going to be looking at another Annie news video about Shalltear. I think this is the last one about Shalltear. So this is why is she the strongest in Nazarick, and we're going to find out what about her makes her the strongest, because like we already know that she's got like a crazy number of powers and abilities, and like her stats are off the charts, but we're going to find out why those things are put together to make her the strongest character, and why Provocations or whatever his name is, how he built her so well. I'm looking forward to discovering it. And I hope that you've all enjoyed this little deep dive into Shalltear with me. Yeah, let's go.
In previous lore videos, we tried to answer a simple question: how strong is the NPC? To do this, we analyzed the possible intentions and personality of the creator, as well as the nature and details of the build in order to explore each NPC's combat potential and job. Basically, we looked at how they might be used in the game Yggdrasil, as well as roughly how powerful they stood next to other NPCs from the game. But in the case of Shalltear, the answer has been stated rather clearly. Shalltear is the strongest floor guardian, and the second strongest NPC, below the mysterious Rubetto. So to finish off this three-part power profile of Shalltear's character, rather than answer the usual question of how strong is Shalltear, instead, we're gonna look at why is Shalltear so strong.
Why is Shalltear? Does anybody ever ask how is Shalltear?
Interesting question, because considering that Rubetto had a unique creation process theorized to be from the direct contribution.
Though I think the real question you should always be asking is where is Shalltear, because if you don't know that, you might be in trouble.
We're gonna look at why is Shalltear so strong. It's an interesting question because considering that Rubetto had a unique creation process theorized to be from the direct contribution of a world item, that would mean among all of the ordinary NPCs created by the 41 members of Ainz Provocations had managed to create the strongest. But how? What makes Shalltear so special? But before we do that, we still have to finish off the last part of her build that defines her full capabilities, her equipment.
Yeah, oh yeah, because we've only really talked about her powers and stuff. We haven't even gotten into the stuff she's got.
Don't forget that the Succubae and Pleiades merch are available in the link in the description. Now, let's begin. Her weapon is a divine class item, translated either as Spuit Lance or Pipette Lance. Pipette is the technical term for what is often called an eyedropper, while Spuit is the Dutch word for a syringe, needle, or spout. As a lance, it's rather difficult to wield effectively in a melee battle, as Shalltear is generally limited to thrusting it at her opponent, making it difficult to block, parry, or feint. Shalltear would often employ her flight magic to charge at an enemy with lightning-fast speeds, leveraging speed.
The thrust is the fastest kind of attack to make on a thing. It's so quick, and so like it can be very, very difficult to parry those. It's possible, of course, but like you also have to know what you're doing. But it's just hard to read it, especially if it's already kind of out in front of you, and then like you can Cavacione around like their blade or their whatever they've got. Like there's so many options with thrusts. I do like that. That's my go-to if I'm fighting. I usually like something I can do a lot of thrusts with, as opposed to slicing action. It's just easier to counter those, and it's easier to block them, to parry them, to counter strike. Thrusts are just faster.
Need to increase the power of her blows.
You do have to be close,
the same way that a lancer on horseback would. Of course, given Shalltear's overwhelming strength, she can also use its thin, durable tip as a sword against weaker opponents. Now, as a divine class item, it would be among the strongest of all weapons aside from world class items. But it appears that much of its data crystal capacity, the power level defining trait of weapons in Yggdrasil, was devoted to enabling its special ability. An ability that lets her steal a fraction of the damage it deals as life force, drawing it out of the target like a syringe and into a large circular chamber where it can then be used by Shalltear as immediate healing. So yeah, this weapon granted passive lifesteal, giving her the ability to heal herself for free so long as she can directly strike her opponent with it, making her very effective in battles of attrition against melee opponents or groups of weaklings.
That is cool.
Then, as we saw during her battle with Ainz, she can also use it to heal off of her own summons, a feature that wasn't available in Yggdrasil due to the fact that friendly fire was disabled. Generally speaking,
I mean, the fact that she figured that out that quickly, though, I mean, it means that I probably, if like Yggdrasil had been if it had come to life in a way, instead of just as a different world, if Yggdrasil had actually come to life, like, she probably would have tried it and it wouldn't have worked, but.
It seems to drain blood from the target, since Shalltear claims she can use this drain ability to extract the blood from her opponents in order to avoid triggering her blood frenzy passive.
Ooh.
But if the target doesn't have any blood, it somehow still works fine. But don't ask me how or why this works.
It's magic, it's the idea about it. Blood is life force, so you suck the life force out. Like I feel like that is one that you can kind of like hand wash away pretty easily, with it just being like, it's metaphorical. And so it's like, it drains the essence from you. What's keeping you alive right now? Blood. What's keeping the shadow creature alive right now? Shadows. Just that's my interpretation, and has often been my interpretation of that kind of weapon and that kind of ability.
It was never really explained. Then, her only other noticeable pieces of equipment are her legendary unnamed armor, the game encyclopedia from Perraroncino, and the ring of Ainz.
Ow.
You're already well aware of what the ring does.
Yeah.
So, how about the armor? Well, the details on the functionality of it are currently unknown.
Oh,
it also
secrets.
doesn't have any special abilities or features.
It's
All we know
cool.
is that it's intended to be used as her primary set of combat gear. So, the only thing that we can speculate for this is that it must somewhat boost her strength, provide physical or magical protection, or even power up her special abilities. Perhaps,
I mean, even if it just like boosts her armor class up a little bit, you know? Like, if she's a squishy AC 14, generally, she puts on the armor, get an AC 16 or 17, like that can help a lot.
even some combination of all three. Which leaves us
Especially
now
if it
with
gives
the
her
game
magic
encyclopedia.
resistance too.
It was gifted to her by Ainz one day, as a reward for her ever-loyal service. Ainz was rewarding all the NPCs, but always had a hard time thinking of a good gift, especially since they would claim to never want anything. So he began giving them items
like a
that were
woman.
once owned by their creators. The encyclopedia
Anything's
was part
fine.
of a set of starting items for all players, and contained a bestiary with a list of all the monsters in the game. By default, it had very little information in it, aside from the in-game lore, reason being that it was meant to be filled by the player, with detailed information on gameplay statistics, like
Okay.
stats, abilities, and combat tactics. Perraroncino, being the power gamer he was, nearly filled its entirety by the time he had quit the game.
Nice,
But
good job,
before handing it
Perraroncino.
over to Ainz, he had erased nearly everything inside of it.
Bad
Most
job,
likely
Perraroncino!
due to inappropriate things he had written in it that was too embarrassing for him to share with Ainz.
Too embarrassing for him to even share. Oh, because he was like pretty open with Momonga. He's like, "Oh, this is too bad. You would definitely see me differently. Clear my browser history before I die. Here you go."
So that's her equipment. Now let's get back to answering the video's title question. I've given you all this information on the individual specifics of Shalltear's build, but it's when you put them all together and see the end result and bigger picture of what Perraroncino created that you notice how truly impressive it is. You see, Perraroncino created a physical and magical hybrid that wasn't too weak at either, something that was very uncommon to find in Yggdrasil due to the seemingly impossible balancing act that you'd have to perform to make
I
it.
love that. That was a good edit. The seemingly impossible balancing act as Evil Eye like balances on this ice umbrella thing. That was good. Kudos to the editor.
Viable. Remember, the chances of success of certain spells depended on the level of the caster and their investment in magic-related classes.
Makes sense.
So things like crowd control spells cast by fighter-caster hybrids would likely not be very useful against someone with high defensive magic. Similarly, melee fighters relied on a large selection of abilities to fight, some with low cooldowns and others which could only be used a few times a day. But this allowed for effective combinations of moves when in combat. Thus, lacking variety in abilities like these would make it difficult for Shalltear to competently fill that fighter role, or even duel a specialized CQC fighter effectively, since
Close
she
quarters
would
combat.
likely run out of special abilities before them and end up being essentially powerless at that point. So then, why is it that with this seemingly jack-of-all-trades master-of-none type build, is she still considered the strongest 1v1 fighter? Well, the first step to answering that lies in her role as an NPC back in the video game Yggdrasil.
Okay.
You see, 1v1s weren't exactly common in this game. The core gameplay
That makes sense.
revolved-
That makes sense because it was guilds, right? So it's about teamwork. So 1v1s wouldn't necessarily be the fun part. And if that tracks with like D&D games too, because if it's like, you know, they borrowed a lot of D&D stuff for Yggdrasil, for Overlord, for the whole thing. It's like you play with a team, right? It tends to be more fun to, if you're having a battle, you're battling with each other, and like there's different strengths and weaknesses that everyone brings. Every so often you'll get like a fun 1v1 sort of fight. Like if you watch Critical Role, like Grog in season 1 sometimes has a couple of little pit fights that he does, and it's a 1v1, and those are like, they're all right. They're not my favorite parts to listen to, just because, you know, it's like I like to see all of them doing fun stuff. And as a player, I also like to help do fun things when I can. So but like, yeah, you are fighting with the group of people. Very rarely just one person is going to be fighting just one other person. It's usually groups. So teamwork makes the dream work. We're actually playing a campaign right now, and we're pretty low level because we just started like a month ago. And so we're in this situation now where it's like we had this great plan, and then it turns out that like some things of it immediately went off the rails. Of course. And now I'm like, I've got one spell slot left, so I have to save that until like the last possible minute, but I also only have like one useful cantrip right now, and I've got no armor, and my strength is -4. So that means anything I try to do with a melee weapon or like a crossbow or anything, I have to like subtract point. Like I can literally do negative damage to people. Like I could hit them, but it's not gonna do anything. I'm like, this is such a bad situation for me to be in.
Around the mechanics of group fights. And as it is with any team game, a group of specialists with dedicated roles are often stronger than a group of generalists. We can see this concept in action in a lot of places, from video games to even sports. And the way it goes is that, generally, the smaller the number of people on each team, the more versatile each individual has to become. This being due to the fact that each person has to cover more roles and be knowledgeable in more fundamental aspects of the game.
That's right.
Take badminton, for example. There's not exactly significant division of duty when playing doubles with a partner. Both players need to be highly skilled in nearly all aspects of the game in order to compete properly. Though sometimes
It's still, I know it's badminton, I can't say it though. When I was a kid, we always called it badminton, and it was just like, so in my brain it's badminton. Not like, I literally get rid of half of the internal letters. Badminton. So I want to go play some badminton. Badminton. I can't say it. It's such a weird word.
sometimes one partner favors the back while the other partner favors the front. But for games that have large teams, like football, or games with a variable and potentially limitless number of participants, like say war, politics, or the economy, well, it's there that you see the most specialization. It's also there where there are two main paths to victory. Either play the existing game better than your opponents, or completely change how the game is played. You either find a collection of people who are so hyper-specialized that your opponent can't even hope to match them, or you create a new mix of roles and a new strategy for employing them that allows you to defeat your opponent in an unexpected way. For the most part, Yggdrasil played like the latter, but it was through having a group of specialists that you can employ both of these strategies. You could attack your opponent with anywhere from a single person to an army of thousands of summons, NPCs, mercenaries, and players. Thus, the game primarily rewarded large groups of players who were specialized and could create strategies that leverage cooperation and synergy. That's not to say that you couldn't create these same synergies with some generalist type characters as well. They'd just be slightly less effective, but at the same time, have less weaknesses. It's just that while specialized characters normally come with disadvantages and downsides, so long as you can avoid being in situations where those disadvantages matter, then you actually lose nothing for specializing. Ainz's former guild is a prime example of this, as it was filled with these specialist type characters, and each had synergy with other members. But that's a topic for another video.
Working together.
What I'm getting at is, if the game was so focused on team-based combat, then where does the 1v1 aspects come into play? If you're a solo player, a dueler, or a competitor in 1v1 tournaments, then yeah, sure, Shalltear's build would make sense. But since Shalltear is none of those, then it would seem that she was designed to just be good in small fight scenarios. She frequently accompanied Ainz when he went to confront lone intruders that would enter Nazarick during the days of Yggdrasil, and this surprisingly wasn't uncommon. Lone scouts were sent all the time to scope out enemy guild bases. There was low risk on a single person being captured and killed, and the reward for any knowledge on the inner workings of the base were very much worth it.
Yeah, especially because you'd only lose like, what, 5 levels, but you still like know your stuff, right? So it's like, well, all right, fine. I'll go in, I'll find out some info, and maybe I die, but then just I'll come back.
So, not wanting to reveal any of Nazarick's strength, tactics, or defense strategies, they would send as few people as possible to take on the intruders. And most often, Shalltear and Ainz were more than enough to take care of them.
Yeah,
meaning
sounds
that
right.
if the enemies wanted to know more, they'd have to bring a much larger group, or even an army, and risk a lot more loss at the same time. So, whether or not Perraroncino carefully considered her role, it's clear that in practice, she ended up being a useful member of Nazarick's defense force. But what really makes Shalltear so good in 1v1 battles? Obviously, if she had better gear or higher stats, she'd be able to beat a weaker opponent easily. And as a matter of fact, part of the reason for her strength can be found in the fact that her base combat statistics average out among the highest of the NPCs with character sheets. Sporting a total of 732 stat points, 43 points ahead of Albedo and Mare, who are tied for second.
Holy crap,
if her
wow.
opponents were highly skilled, they could probably just exploit her AI. After all, normally, she was just an NPC that could only rely on simple programming scripts.
Yeah, that's fair.
Let's focus on her sentient self. And
she's alive now!
She wasn't a complete idiot, meaning she would use all her skills.
Right, because she is, though. She is kind of a moron. Right, he keeps talking about that.
And abilities optimally and to the best of their ability. In any 1v1 between characters of equal caliber, the victor is typically the one who has access to the most options. Now, I'm going to be using this word a lot, so keep in mind that options just means the number of paths that she can take at any given time, due to whatever skills, abilities, or items are currently available to her. So what I mean when I say that the person with the most options will usually win, is that if for any situation during the fight, if you have the option or opportunity to counter your opponent's move with one of your own, and you are knowledgeable enough to know when to use said moves, then you'll most likely win that fight. Imagine in fighting games, the little hierarchies of movesets, where basic attack spam is countered by guarding, and guard spamming is countered by throws. But if the enemy predicts that you're going to throw him because he's guard spamming, then he has the opportunity to counter it with an attack of his own. Now, imagine if one person...
That's something that happens in a lot of fights too. It's like you bait them, essentially. You do the same move multiple times, and then the next time it's fate. Like that is a way to win fights. That is something I have seen employed, but it's been a long time since I've like done a fight for real. So I don't know if I could still do it. I would have to practice.
Had a fourth option, like a grapple hook, and the enemy did not. This grapple hook would counter both the grab and the guard spamming, limiting the number of options that the enemy had, meaning the one with the grapple hook would likely win the fight.
Scorpion.
Now, imagine once again that instead of something simple like that, we now have a complex tree of skills and abilities that counters others and are countered by others. Then naturally, those with the most sets of powerful options available for their use at any given time will have the edge over an opponent with less. So, for a game like Yggdrasil, where build customization was seemingly endless, it's more likely that an anomaly like Shalltear will arise, one that has access to the most strongest options. And just like it was with teamfights, the versatility you get from having options is vital to any 1v1. However, that doesn't mean that someone like Pandora's Actor, someone who has a wide array of options available to him at any time, would necessarily be the best at 1v1s. These options require some degree of strength in order to be useful. Just because you can do something doesn't mean that it will be effective. If you spread yourself too thin,
it doesn't mean you can do it well.
Number of options, then it doesn't matter how many you have because they'll all be too weak to be meaningful or impactful. Then, by contrast, a hyper-specialist may have one option that's very strong and thus very effective for winning against certain opponents, but they'd be extremely weak in other situations. Take Perraroncino's sniper build, for example.
That really threw me off.
He can instantly kill individual targets from long range, but take that range away from him, and it's less likely that he'll be able to one-shot you. So
Well, yeah. Oh, that's the thing in D&D too. It's like you're you have to be in like a sort of a sweet spot for a lot of for like bow combat. Like you have to be like you have to be far enough away. As soon as you get within like 10 or 15 feet, like you get disadvantage usually. Now that'll depend on your DM a little bit, like how far away you actually are, how like what does it matter? But there are certain weapons that the game tells you that if you are not within a certain sweet spot, if you're too close or you're too far, you start getting disadvantage on your rolls to actually be able to hit and do actual damage.
Makes someone strong at 1v1s is having a mixture of these two extremes. Having options that are strong enough to give you a decisive advantage, while also having a diverse enough array of them so that you have multiple different alternatives for situations when your opponent is too powerful and you need some kind of counter strategy. Generally, there are two kinds of options. Ones which are powerful enough to force the enemy to devise a specific strategy or technique to defeat them, and ones which are only really used to counter an enemy's specific strategy or technique.
Right,
a good build
that
will
makes
have
sense.
lots of options in the former, in order to cover as many bases as possible, as well as a few in the latter.
We call them provocations in my swords class, or it's HEMA. I am involved in that, but like we call it provocations. If like we have whole sections that just learning about provocations, which is like you aim your sword and a thrust at the hand, and it causes them to force to block. Because if they don't block, then if they try to parry you because you're going for something a little closer than what they're going for, it usually ends up with you at least stabbing their hand, and they can't really stab you. So they have to block, and that gives you the option of feinting and going up for a thrust at their armpit or their throat or something. So it just gives you a little bit more of an option. It forces you to put their sword where you want it, not where they want it. Which is a good way to win a fight. And of course, there are parries and like responses and all of that. Like it's not always going to work, but it's a good way to sort of gauge and test to see what your opponent's going to do.
To reduce their number of glaring and easily exploitable weaknesses. So let's apply all this 1v1 theory to Shalltear now. Consider her mobility. She has access to the fly spell, various teleportation spells, as well as immunity to having her mobility restricted. This gives her options against opponents at many ranges. At long range, she can fly or teleport to chase them down, and at short range, she can do the same to maintain distance and kite with ranged spells. And there's really nothing that her opponents can do to keep her in place due to her immunities. This gives her mobility options that can't be significantly countered, and the only feasible response to it would be to have better mobility than she does. Now
Which is
let's consider
unlikely.
her healing. Her investments in restoring HP and MP means that she can survive for a long time in battles of attrition. She can just gain health back with her Spuit Lance, then use her blood to gain back mana from enemies with blood. Of course, those who can avoid getting hit often or are of a race that doesn't have blood, then that would diminish Shalltear's advantages. But that's why she has other sources
High dex!
High-powered healing spells that can instantly fill her HP bar. But what if you one-shot her with someone like Ulbert or Ainz? Well, Pararonchino gave her a consumable specifically for occasions like these. One that allows her to instantly revive once. And if all that is still not enough to outlast her opponent,
Okay, I mean, like, those, that's a little bit weird. That I feel like would work better in a video game, because this is like, you have to be awake to take that consumable, unless it's like the half-orc trait that you can have. I think it's a half-orc trait, where when you go down to 0 hit points, you can automatically regain 1, and then you have 1 hit point, and then you're awake, at least, and you can do whatever you want. And then you could take the consumable. That would be so mean.
She then has her summons to slowly wear her opponent down. But if an opponent can counter these summons, then it'd be best not to use them at all. Notice how Ainz didn't summon any of his undead, despite that being a major aspect of his build. This was because Shalltear could easily kill them and then use them as mobile
that would be
lifesteal
bad.
stations. On the other hand, Shalltear's summons against Ainz forced him to use valuable and limited resources to destroy them. It's a scenario that highlights that knowing when not to use your options is just as important as knowing when to use them. Shalltear's Ainz is another good example of an ability that gives her lots of options. Being able to swarm and double team her opponent, or even have it protect her while she fires spells from a distance, goes
here
a long way in making any 1v1 exponentially harder for the opponent.
That was one of those that, like, again, he explained what that was the last time, and I found out that I've always said it wrong. It's not enherar, which I always thought it was.
It's a key.
So I forgot what it was talking about for a second.
Countered, and I don't imagine that many other people have it.
Probably
it
not.
Also heavily reduces the number of options her opponent can have, as the scope of her abilities just greatly increased. Knowing all this now, Shalltear's build, in a nutshell, is
she can turn a 1v1 into a 2-on-1, which is not fair.
And dominating options. The clone to double damage output or distract enemies, the spells to harass from long range or heal herself, the summons to overwhelm opponents, flight to chase them down, barriers to defend herself, and so on. A lot of these stem from magic, and magic is basically the primary tool that opens up more options.
Yeah.
Each spell paves more paths to be taken during a fight. And whether that path leads to a counter resulting in a dead end, or keeps leading to victory, is completely dependent on the user. Of course, there comes a point where you can have too many spells, and you end up having a bunch in your arsenal that are just ineffective. The standard for Yggdrasil was around 300, with the exception of Ainz, who had over 700,
that's still so many.
Each had very narrow applications. As for Shalltear, she realistically only needs around 100 to effectively cover and account for most situations.
It's still a lot of spells at once.
If used optimally by a not-so-dumb version of Shalltear, it would lead to her victory in a 1v1 almost all the time. So why did she lose to Ainz? Well, mostly for that reason. She didn't capitalize on everything that she had at her disposal. You see, Ainz's options were severely limited. He was forced to use mostly direct damage spells that he wasn't specialized in, forcing the fight into a battle of attrition, where by all means, Shalltear should have won. But because Ainz bluffed the existence of more than one exploding line trap spell, he was able to trick Shalltear into thinking that there were dozens all around her.
She failed that insight check is what?
Both on the floor and in the air. In turn, Shalltear couldn't take the risk because the damage that these did were significant and would cost a lot more MP in order to heal. This forced her to stay at range, allowing Ainz to continue to sling spells from a distance and capitalize on Shalltear's low magic defense stats, one of her few exploitable weaknesses.
I love that it's a low magic defense stat and yet it's still over 50. Like, that's crazy. Because I feel like we've seen some of the other stat cards and it's like, it's between 0 and 50. It's like, this is her lowest stat. That's nuts.
But if Shalltear had just played it smarter and used her summons to check for traps, then she would have easily been able to see that these traps were merely bluffs, and she could have continued to engage at closer range. Of course, she did eventually realize that it was a bluff, but Ainz was ready to counter all of her other options. By waiting to use the goal of all life is death, he was able to take out 3 of Shalltear's most powerful tools, Ainz, her resurrection item, and all of her summons.
Because he made him put him on the field.
The full extent of her build, causing Shalltear to fight in a way that Ainz expected. He'd then use specific spells in order to bait out others, causing her to exhaust her mana and skills before using his big instant death spell, which brought the fight to the endgame. This resulted in her being unprepared for Ainz's secret weapons. So, as you can tell, though Ainz was going into the fight handicapped, he used his options effectively, and this led to his victory.
Because he's smart!
If Shalltear was able to do that herself, then yeah, she would beat every other NPC in Nazarick. It's how her build was designed to be. But unfortunately, she's no power gamer, and likely doesn't even understand the full extent of her build. So opponents who are more prepared and more skilled will continue to beat her, despite the vast array of powerful options that are available to her.
Which is probably good. Like, you know, it's more fun to build somebody who's kind of dumb. Like, they're super, super strong or powerful or whatever, but they're kind of dumb, so they're not going to necessarily make the best choices.
That's why Shalltear's so strong, bringing us to the end of Shalltear's character profile. I can't believe I actually started this all the way back in December. Well, she did have more detail on her, so I guess it makes sense. Anyway, the poll has been decided, and the next character covered, or characters I should say, will be Aura and Moray together. Cool. So look forward to that sometime in the future, after of course a few more Shalltear videos. Now, before I go, don't forget that the merch links are in the description below, so feel free to support the channel by grabbing one of those. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do.
Yes, I do!
Until next time, ciao!
Ciao! Always fun. Always very fun. And so the next Annie News videos on Overlord that we're going to watch are going to be Shalltear, Aura, and Moray. there's like 4 videos of them too. Dang. I mean, that makes sense because there's 2 of them. That's really cool. Oh, okay. Fun. All right, I'm looking forward to that. And Codicus. Okay, okay. So I've only got like 8 videos left in this playlist. So I'm like trucking through. Yeah, so I don't know if I'm going to do this one next or if I'm going to like skip around and do a different video. Like on a different show or whatever. I haven't fully decided yet, but this is where we are right now. The next Annie News Overlord is going to be Aura and Mare. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I've really had fun with this Shalltear thing. And today I'm so sorry. I know I just talked a lot about swords today and D&D. I like went off topic so hard. But that is the risk you take when you click on a video where we're going to talk about combat or D&D. So thanks again. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're watching on YouTube. Actually, you know what? You can do it on Patreon too. These videos do come out early on Patreon. And you can hit the like button there if you want to. See you then.